They say blood is thicker than water. But what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from? I'm about to tell you a story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about family, betrayal, and what real love actually looks like. My name is Reese Mitchell, and for 12 years, I was told my grandmother was dead. I mourned her. I missed her. I believed she didn't care enough to stay. But here's the shocking truth. She wasn't dead. She was alive, searching for me, sending letters and gifts that were returned unopened, fighting a legal battle I didn't even know existed. And the person who lied to me, who kept us apart, who locked me in a cage made of manipulation and gaslighting, it was my own father. The man who was supposed to love me unconditionally turned me into a scapegoat, a servant, a ghost in my own home. And the night I finally escaped, it happened because he made one mistake. He humiliated me in front of 30 witnesses on Christmas Eve, locked me outside barefoot in 8-degree weather, and thought he'd gotten away with it. But then a black limousine pulled up. My grandmother stepped out. A lawyer opened a briefcase. And in less than an hour, my father's entire world, built on lies, control, and stolen property, came crashing down. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when the truth finally catches up, when karma stops being patient, and when justice arrives in the form of a 78-year-old woman who refused to give up. What happened next changed my life forever. And I think it'll change the way you see family too. My name is Reese Mitchell. I'm 21 years old, and at exactly 11:47 p.m., on Christmas Eve, my father locked me outside in the freezing cold, barefoot, in nothing but a thin sweater, while the temperature sat at 8 degrees below zero. Through the frosted window, I could see 30 guests laughing, clinking champagne glasses, and cutting into a 4-tier red velvet cake that I'd spent 2 days baking. The Christmas tree lights blinked in perfect rhythm. The garland I'd hung that morning shimmered under the chandelier, and my father, my own father, pulled the curtain shut so no one inside would have to see me shivering on the porch. I couldn't believe this was happening, not on Christmas, not in front of all those people who thought they knew our family. But then, as my fingers went numb and my breath came out in desperate clouds, I heard the low hum of an engine, and everything I thought I knew about betrayal was about to shatter. I always thought the worst moment of my life would be something dramatic. A car crash, a fire, maybe even a betrayal from someone I loved. I was wrong. The worst moment was standing on that porch, watching my own blood family treat me like I didn't exist, like I was some kind of pest they'd finally managed to get rid of. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold bit into my skin. 30 people, neighbors, co-workers, distant relatives, had just witnessed my father throw me out like trash, and not one of them moved. Not one of them said, "Hey, Richard, maybe this is too far." They just stood there, frozen in their own comfort, while I became the ghost at my own family's feast. I felt the weight of their stares even through the glass, the kind of judgment that doesn't need words. What happened next would prove that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, leaving a print that fogged and faded in seconds, just like I had in that house. Inside, my stepmother Brenda wrapped her arm around my stepsister Kelsey, whispering something that made them both smile, and I just knew, they were talking about me. This wasn't the first time I'd been the punchline of their private jokes, but it was the first time it happened in front of an audience this big. My father stood at the head of the table, raising his glass for a toast, his voice muffled but unmistakable. To family, to love, to the people who matter. The truth hit me like a slap. I wasn't in that circle. I never had been. Revenge wasn't even on my mind yet. I was still stuck in shock, trying to piece together how I'd become the villain in a story where I'd done nothing but survive. The cold crept up my legs, sharp and relentless, and I started pacing just to keep the blood moving. My toes were already losing feeling, and I could taste metal in the back of my throat. Fear, exhaustion, maybe both. This was justice, my father had said. This was respect. I'd asked one simple question, "Is there a gift for me?" And he'd exploded, dragged me by the arm, and shoved me out into the night like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. The guests had gasped, sure, but then they'd gone quiet, and I knew what that meant. He was inside right now, spinning the story, painting me as the unstable one, the ungrateful daughter who couldn't just be happy for once. Backstabbed doesn't even begin to cover what this felt like. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years, and I was only just starting to see the shape of it. Then I heard it, the sound that would change everything. A car door slamming, heels clicking on pavement, and a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade calling out a name I'd almost forgotten. Starlight? I turned, my vision blurry from the cold and the tears I refused to let fall. And there she was, a woman stepping out of a sleek black limousine, wrapped in a long wool coat, her silver hair pinned back like she'd just stepped out of an old Hollywood film. I didn't recognize her at first. How could I? I'd been told she was dead. I'd been told she didn't care. But as she moved closer, her eyes locked on mine, and somewhere deep in my frozen chest, something cracked open. My father had lied about a lot of things, but this lie, this one, was about to bring his whole world crashing down. I stumbled forward, barely able to feel my legs, and she caught me before I hit the ground. Her arms were warm, solid, real, and she smelled like lavender and old books, a scent I didn't know I remembered until it surrounded me. "I've got you," she whispered, and for the first time in 12 years I believed someone actually did. Behind her, a man in a gray suit stepped out of the limo, holding a leather briefcase. His expression calm but sharp, like he'd been waiting for this moment as long as she had. I looked back at the house, at the window where my father's face had just appeared, pale and wide-eyed, and I realized something that would fuel everything that came next. This wasn't just about me being cold and humiliated on Christmas Eve. This was about a woman who'd been searching, a family drama that had been buried under lies, and a reckoning that was 12 years overdue. My father, Richard Mitchell, wasn't always a monster, or maybe he was, and I just couldn't see it through the fog of childhood love. But Brenda, my stepmother, and Kelsey, my stepsister, they turned our house into a stage where I was always the one performing, and they were the audience who decided whether I deserved applause or exile. For as long as I could remember, I wasn't treated like a daughter or a sister. I was treated like staff. I cooked, I cleaned, I organized, I served, and when I was done, I disappeared into the background like I'd never been there at all. Family betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or violence. Sometimes it comes with a smile, a pat on the head, and the quiet understanding that you'll never be enough. And the worst part? I believed them. I believed I was the problem. Brenda had this gift, this terrifying, perfect gift, for making herself look like a saint while turning me into the villain. She'd cry at exactly the right moment, her voice trembling just enough to make my father rush to her side, and suddenly, whatever I'd done, or hadn't done, became proof that I was difficult, ungrateful, too sensitive. Kelsey learned from the best. She'd walk past me in the hallway and whisper, "You're so lucky Dad lets you stay here," like I was some kind of charity case instead of his actual daughter. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that even I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I didn't deserve the same love they gave her. Karma felt like a joke back then, something people said to make themselves feel better. Because where was karma when I scrubbed floors while Kelsey got her nails done? The exclusion wasn't always obvious. It was in the small things. The family photos on the wall that somehow never included me. The vacations they planned without asking if I wanted to come. The inside jokes I was never part of. Public humiliation was their specialty, though. Brenda would host dinner parties and introduce Kelsey as our blessing, while I'd be in the kitchen plating food, invisible until someone needed a refill. I'd hear the guests coo over how lucky my father was to have such a perfect family, and I'd wonder if they even knew I existed. The truth was they didn't. I was a shadow, a name mentioned in passing, if at all. And my father? He stood by and let it happen, nodding along like this was normal, like I hadn't been his daughter first. Control came in waves, subtle and suffocating. My father monitored everything, my phone, my browsing history, even the books I checked out from the library. He said it was for my own good, that he just wanted to keep me safe. But I knew better. He wanted to keep me small. He wanted to make sure I never had the tools or the courage to question what was happening. Brenda would smile sweetly and say things like, "Your father just loves you so much, Reese. You should be grateful. But love doesn't isolate. Love doesn't lock doors. Love doesn't turn you into a servant in your own home." I was living in a cage I couldn't see, and every time I tried to push against the bars, they'd tighten just a little more. Kelsey was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and I was the scapegoat, the one who absorbed all the blame. If something broke, it was my fault. If dinner was late, it was because I didn't plan well enough. If Kelsey failed a test, it was because I didn't help her study, even though she never asked. The contrast was constant, brutal, and designed to keep me in my place. I watched her get new clothes, new gadgets, new opportunities, while I wore the same 3 outfits and saved every penny from the part-time job my father barely let me keep. Dignity was something I had to fight for every single day, and most days, I lost. But I kept fighting, because somewhere deep down, I still believed things could change. What I didn't know yet was that the stage they'd built, the roles they'd assigned, the whole twisted family drama, it was all sitting on a foundation of lies so big, so complete, that when it finally cracked, the whole thing would come crashing down. And the woman stepping out of that limo on Christmas Eve? She was holding the sledgehammer. My father's face when he saw her wasn't just shock. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize the person you've been lying about for over a decade just walked back into the story. I didn't know it then, standing there shivering in her arms. But that moment, that exact moment, was the beginning of my father's reckoning and the end of my silence. 12 years ago, I was 9 years old, standing at my mother's funeral in a black dress that was too big for me, holding a single white rose I was supposed to drop into the grave. The sun was too bright for such a dark day, and I remember thinking that was wrong, that the sky should have been gray and crying too. My grandmother, Vivian Hartwell, stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, and she kept whispering, "You're not alone, Starlight. You'll never be alone." I believed her. I believed that even though my mother was gone, I still had someone who loved me, someone who'd protect me. But my father had other plans. 2 weeks after we buried my mom, Vivian disappeared from my life completely, and I was told she didn't want me anymore. I couldn't believe it at first. My grandmother had been at every school play, every birthday, every scraped knee and bad dream. She called me Starlight because she said I lit up every room I walked into. And then, suddenly, nothing. No calls, no visits, no cards on my birthday. My father sat me down one evening, his face serious, and told me that Grandma Vivian had decided to move on with her life, and that it was too painful for her to stay in touch. He said she thought it was better this way, cleaner, easier for everyone. I was 9. I didn't understand clean or easy. I just understood that everyone I loved was leaving, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The betrayal felt like drowning, slow and suffocating, and I didn't even know I was being lied to. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know for over a decade, was that my father had orchestrated the whole thing. 3 weeks after the funeral, he moved us from Portland, Maine to a small town 2 hours away, changed our phone number, and told Vivian we needed space. When she kept trying to reach us, he blocked her emails, returned her letters unopened, and eventually threatened legal action if she didn't stop. He told me she was gone. He told her I didn't want to see her. He built a wall between us made entirely of lies, and we both believed it because we trusted him. That's the thing about family betrayal. It works best when it comes from someone you never thought would hurt you. My father didn't just take my grandmother away. He took my hope. The isolation happened fast. We moved to a neighborhood where I didn't know anyone, and my father enrolled me in a new school where I was always the outsider, always playing catch-up. He said it was for a fresh start, a new beginning after the tragedy, but I see now what it really was. Control. He cut me off from everyone who knew my mother, everyone who might ask questions, everyone who might notice that things weren't right. My friends from Portland stopped calling because I never answered. He'd given me a new number and told me the old one didn't work anymore. Relatives on my mom's side sent cards for a while, but my father intercepted them, and eventually they stopped too. I became a ghost in my own life, and the only people left were the ones he chose: Brenda, Kelsey, and a rotating cast of people who only saw what he wanted them to see. I spent years thinking my grandmother didn't love me. I'd lie awake at night wondering what I'd done wrong, why I wasn't enough to make her stay. The shame of being abandoned twice, first by my mother, who died, and then by my grandmother, who left, was something I carried like a stone in my chest. I stopped talking about her. I stopped asking questions. I learned that grief was something you buried, not something you shared, because sharing only made my father uncomfortable. He'd get this look, this tight, irritated expression, and he'd say, "We don't talk about that anymore, Reese. It's time to move forward." So I did. I moved forward into a life where I was alone, where I was less than, where I was whatever Brenda and Kelsey needed me to be. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried deep. And on that freezing Christmas Eve, when Vivian Hartwell stepped out of that limo and called me Starlight, every lie my father had ever told began to unravel. I didn't know it yet, standing there in the cold, but the wall he'd built between us was about to come down, brick by brick, lie by lie. And what we'd find on the other side wouldn't just be answers. It would be proof of a betrayal so calculated, so deliberate, that it would change everything I thought I knew about my father, my family, and the last 12 years of my life. When Brenda moved into our house 6 months after my mother's funeral, I thought maybe things would get better. I thought maybe my father wouldn't be so sad anymore. And maybe I'd have someone who'd care about me the way my mom did. I was wrong. The first thing Brenda did was take my bedroom, the room my mother had painted pale yellow with little stars on the ceiling, and give it to Kelsey, her daughter from a previous marriage, who was only a year younger than me. She said Kelsey needed a space that felt like home, and my father nodded, agreeing without even looking at me. I was moved to the basement, a cold, unfinished space with concrete floors and a single small window that barely let in any light. That's when I learned what it meant to be a scapegoat. I wasn't just less important than Kelsey. I was disposable. The basement became my prison, but it was disguised as my own space. Brenda called it that, smiling her fake smile, telling me I was lucky to have privacy and independence. But independence meant isolation. It meant I ate dinner alone after everyone else had finished, heating up leftovers in the microwave while they laughed upstairs. It meant I did my homework by the dim light of a single lamp because the overhead fluorescent buzzed too loud and gave me headaches. It meant I went to bed listening to the sound of their voices through the ceiling. Family movie nights, board games, conversations I wasn't invited to join. Revenge wasn't something I understood yet. I was too busy trying to survive, trying to stay invisible enough that I wouldn't cause problems, but visible enough that I wouldn't completely disappear. Brenda didn't just take my room. She took my role. I became the maid, the cook, the organizer, the one responsible for making sure the house ran smoothly while she played the role of devoted wife and mother. She'd wake me up at 6 a.m. to start breakfast, even on weekends. And if the eggs were too runny or the toast was too dark, she'd sigh dramatically and say, "I guess I'll have to do everything myself." My father never questioned it. He never asked why his daughter was doing all the work while his stepdaughter got to sleep in and be treated like royalty. Kelsey learned fast that she didn't have to lift a finger. I'd do it for her. And if I ever complained, if I ever said I was tired or overwhelmed, Brenda would cry, and my father would tell me I was being selfish. Backstabbed doesn't even cover it. I was being erased. The invisibility was the worst part. I'd walk into a room and people would talk over me, through me, like I wasn't there. Brenda would introduce Kelsey to her friends as my daughter, and then gesture vaguely in my direction and say, "Oh, and that's Reese." No explanation, no connection, just a name attached to a body they'd rather not see. I started wearing the same clothes over and over because no one noticed anyway. I stopped doing my hair, stopped wearing makeup, stopped trying to be anything other than what they'd decided I was, the help. My self-worth shrank with every passing day, every ignored greeting, every time I served dinner and no one said thank you. I was living in the same house as my father, and I'd never felt more alone. What kept me going, what kept me from completely disappearing, was the tiny, stubborn part of me that remembered being Starlight. I remembered my grandmother's voice, her laugh, the way she'd braid my hair and tell me stories about my mother. Those memories felt like a lifeline, even though I'd been told they were lies, that she didn't care, that she'd abandoned me just like everyone else. But late at night in the basement, I'd close my eyes and try to remember the sound of her voice, the smell of her perfume, and I'd wonder if maybe, just maybe, my father had been wrong. I'd wonder if there was a version of the truth I hadn't been told. And that wondering, that tiny seed of doubt, would one day grow into something my father couldn't control. I didn't know it then, but the basement wasn't just my prison. It was also where I'd find the first clue that everything I'd been told was a lie. There was a box hidden behind the old furnace, covered in dust and cobwebs, and inside that box was a piece of my past that would shatter the carefully constructed story my father and Brenda had built. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't even looking for answers yet, but the truth has a way of finding you, even when you've been taught to stop looking. And when it did, when I finally saw what they'd been hiding, I'd realized that the worst betrayal wasn't just what they'd done to me. It was how long they'd made me believe I deserved it. I found the box on a Saturday afternoon in November, 2 years after Brenda had moved me to the basement. I was cleaning, which was always my job, and I'd been told to organize the storage area near the furnace. The box was shoved way in the back, behind old paint cans and broken Christmas decorations, and something about it caught my eye. Maybe the way the dust sat on it, thick and undisturbed, like it had been hidden on purpose. My hands shook as I pulled it out, and when I opened it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Inside were things that belonged to my mother, her jewelry, old photographs, a leather journal with her handwriting, and letters. So many letters. And right on top, like it was waiting for me, was a photo of my grandmother Vivian smiling at the camera, dated just 6 months ago. The truth hit me like a slap. My father had told me Vivian was dead. He'd told me she'd passed away a year after my mother, that it was too painful to talk about, that I needed to let go and move on. But here she was, alive, smiling, holding a sign that read, "Happy 78th birthday to me," with balloons in the background. I sat on that cold concrete floor, staring at the photo, and felt something inside me crack open. Not sadness, not even anger yet. Just this raw, terrible realization that everything I'd been told for the last 12 years was a lie. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me. She hadn't stopped loving me. She'd been stolen from me, and I'd been lied to so perfectly, so completely, that I'd believed it without question. This was betrayal on a level I didn't even know existed. I spent the next hour going through that box like it was a crime scene, because that's what it was. Evidence of a crime against my heart, my history, my right to know the people who loved me. There were birthday cards Vivian had sent, all returned unopened, with "Return to sender" stamped in red ink. There were Christmas gifts, still wrapped, with tags that said, "To my Starlight, with all my love." There were letters, dozens of them, each one more desperate than the last, begging my father to let her see me, to let her know I was okay, to just send a photo. The last letter was dated 8 months ago, and it said, "Richard, I don't know what I did to deserve this, but Reese deserves better. She deserves to know she's loved. Please don't take that from her." I read that line over and over, tears streaming down my face, because someone had been fighting for me, and I hadn't even known. I took the photo of Vivian and one of the letters and hid them in my pillowcase, then carefully put the box back exactly where I'd found it. I didn't know what to do with what I'd learned, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let my father know I knew. Not yet. For the first time in years, I had something that was mine, something they couldn't take away, and I needed to protect it. But the knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and sharp, and I started seeing everything differently. Every time my father talked about moving forward, or Brenda said I should be grateful for this family, I'd think about that box, about those letters, about the woman who'd been trying to reach me for over a decade. Shocking doesn't even begin to describe what it felt like to realize your entire life has been a performance, and you're the only one who didn't know you were acting. I started paying closer attention after that, not just to what they said, but to what they didn't say. I noticed how my father would change the subject whenever anyone mentioned my mother or asked about her family. I noticed how Brenda would steer conversations away from the past, always pushing toward the future, toward Kelsey's achievements, toward anything that didn't involve me or my history. I noticed how they'd trained me to stop asking questions, to accept their version of reality without pushing back. And I started to understand that the basement wasn't just about space, it was about control. They needed me isolated, cut off, dependent, so I wouldn't start digging, wouldn't start wondering, wouldn't start demanding answers. But it was too late for that now. I'd seen the truth, and there was no unseeing it. After that box, I stopped trying to be loved and started trying to be right. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover for another month, was that my father hadn't just hidden my past, he'd been actively destroying it. The box I'd found was just a fraction of what Vivian had sent over the years. The rest, the birthday presents and the holiday cards and the carefully wrapped gifts, had been thrown away, donated, or in some cases, sold. And when I found out exactly what Brenda had done with my mother's jewelry, the jewelry that was supposed to be mine, the betrayal would cut even deeper. Because it wasn't just about keeping me from my grandmother anymore. It was about erasing my mother, erasing my history, and turning me into someone who had no claim to anything, not even my own memories. And that's when I'd realized that revenge wasn't something I wanted. It was something I was owed. The box disappeared 3 days later. I'd gone to school, come home, and when I checked the hiding spot behind the furnace, it was gone. Completely gone, like it had never existed. Panic shot through me like ice water, and I tore through the basement looking for it, checking every corner, every shelf, every possible place it could have been moved. Nothing. I couldn't believe they'd found it. I'd been so careful, so quiet, but somehow they knew. Or maybe they'd always known it was there and had been waiting to see if I'd find it. Either way, the message was clear. Nothing in this house was truly mine. Not even the truth. I felt humiliated all over again. Like I'd been caught doing something wrong when all I'd done was discover what they'd stolen from me. That night at dinner, I sat at the table. They'd started making me eat with them again, probably so they could keep a closer eye on me. And I watched Brenda's face for any sign that she knew. She was all smiles, passing the mashed potatoes to Kelsey, complimenting my father on his new promotion at work, acting like everything was perfect. But I'd learned to read the small things, the micro expressions she thought no one noticed. And when she glanced at me, just for a second, there was something there. Satisfaction, maybe, or triumph. She knew, and she wanted me to know that she knew. The power dynamic had shifted, and she was reminding me exactly where I stood. I was nothing. I had nothing. And if I tried to fight back, I'd lose. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Brenda was wearing a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a small emerald pendant that I recognized immediately. It had been in the box. It had been my mother's. My grandmother had given it to her on her wedding day, and my mother had worn it every single day until she got sick. I'd seen it in photos, touched it when I was little, remembered the way it caught the light when she'd lean down to kiss me goodnight, and now Brenda was wearing it like it was hers, like she had any right to it. The rage that rose up in me was so sudden, so fierce, that I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from saying something that would get me thrown out of the house for good. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was theft. This was desecration. I waited until everyone was asleep. Then I grabbed my father's laptop. He always left it on the kitchen counter, unlocked, because he didn't think I'd dare. And I started searching. I checked his browsing history, his emails, anything I could find, and that's when I saw it. Brenda had been selling my mother's jewelry, not at a pawn shop or a consignment store where it might draw attention, but on Facebook Marketplace, to strangers who'd never know where it came from or what it meant. There were listings for a pearl bracelet, a silver locket, a pair of diamond earrings, all items I'd seen in that box. The descriptions were vague, just vintage jewelry, great condition, must sell, and the prices were laughably low, like she was desperate to get rid of them fast. I felt sick. This wasn't about money. This was about erasing my mother completely, about making sure there was nothing left of her for me to hold on to. I took screenshots of everything. The listings, the messages, the proof that Brenda Mitchell had been selling stolen jewelry that belonged to my dead mother. Then I deleted my browsing history, closed the laptop, and went back to the basement. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I'd learned and what I could do with it. If I confronted them, they'd deny it, twist it around, make me look like the crazy one. My father would side with Brenda like he always did, and I'd end up right back where I started, maybe worse. But the evidence was real, the screenshots were real, and somewhere out there, my grandmother was real too. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had something I hadn't had before: proof. And proof changes everything. The next morning, I worked up the courage to say something. It was stupid, reckless, maybe even suicidal given how much power they had over me. But I couldn't let it go. I cornered my father in the hallway before he left for work and said, my voice shaking, "I know about the jewelry. I know what Brenda's doing." He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd be shocked. He'd be angry at her instead of me. But when he turned around, his face was cold, impassive, and all he said was, "Leave it alone, Reese." Not, "What jewelry?" Not, "I don't know what you're talking about." Just, "Leave it alone." Like he knew exactly what she was doing and didn't care. Like my mother's memory meant nothing to him. And that's when I realized the truth wasn't just about what had been hidden. It was about what had been chosen. My father had chosen Brenda over me, over my mother, over everything we'd been. And there was no coming back from that. I left it alone. What choice did I have? I was 17, still in high school, with no money, no car, no way to leave even if I wanted to. So I went back to the basement, back to being invisible, back to serving and cleaning and pretending I didn't know what I knew. But something had changed inside me. The silence I'd been living in, the silence I'd thought was peace, or at least survival. I finally understood what it really was. It was comfort. Comfort for them. My silence made their lives easier, smoother, free of guilt or consequences. And as long as I stayed quiet, as long as I kept my head down and played my role, nothing would ever change. I'd spend the rest of my life in that basement, or some version of it, waiting for someone to save me. But no one was coming. If I wanted out, I'd have to build the door myself. I started keeping a journal, hidden under my mattress, where I wrote down everything: dates, conversations, things Brenda said, things my father ignored, the way Kelsey would smirk when I got in trouble for something she'd done. I documented the chores they gave me, the hours I spent cooking and cleaning while they watched TV upstairs. I took more screenshots when I could, saved emails, kept the evidence of the jewelry sales. I didn't know what I'd do with it all, but I knew that one day, when the moment came, I'd need proof that this wasn't just in my head, that I wasn't the difficult or dramatic daughter they'd painted me as. The truth was my only weapon, and I was going to sharpen it until it could cut through every lie they'd ever told. The breaking point came 4 years later, when I was 21. I'd just finished my first semester of community college, paid for with student loans and a part-time job at a diner because my father refused to help with tuition, saying I needed to learn responsibility. I'd come home for Christmas break, exhausted and burnt out, but still hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. Instead, my father announced that he was throwing the biggest Christmas party we'd ever had. 30 guests, catered food, live music, the whole thing. And then he looked at me and said, "You'll handle the cooking and decorations, right, Reese? Brenda and Kelsey have been so busy." It wasn't a question. It was never a question. And that's when I realized this was it. This was the test. This was them pushing me to see how much more I'd take before I finally broke. I spent 2 weeks preparing for that party. I baked a 4-tier red velvet cake from scratch, made 3 kinds of appetizers, hung garland and lights in every room, set the table with the good china that I wasn't allowed to use for myself. I worked 16-hour days while Kelsey got her nails done and Brenda went shopping for a new dress. And when Christmas Eve finally came, when the guests started arriving and complimenting my father on the beautiful home and the incredible spread, I stood in the corner of the kitchen and waited. Waited for someone to say thank you. Waited for my father to introduce me as his daughter, not just the girl who's helping out. Waited for literally any sign that I mattered, but it never came. The party went on, the champagne flowed, and I was invisible. Again. And then came the moment that would change everything. They started handing out gifts, big, elaborate presents wrapped in expensive paper, with everyone's names on them except mine. I watched Kelsey open a new laptop. I watched Brenda tear into a designer handbag. I watched my father hand out bottles of wine and gift cards to people he barely knew. And I stood there, empty-handed, my heart pounding, because I couldn't believe they'd do this, not in front of all these people, not on Christmas. The humiliation was suffocating, but I'd been humiliated before. What I hadn't done before, what I'd never had the courage to do, was ask the question out loud. So I took a deep breath, stepped into the living room and said, my voice quiet but clear, "Is there a gift for me?" The room went silent. I mean dead silent, like someone had hit a pause button on the entire universe. 30 faces turned toward me, some confused, some curious, some already starting to look uncomfortable because they could sense what was about to happen. My father's face went white, then red, and I saw the exact moment he made his choice. Not to apologize. Not to laugh it off and say he'd forgotten. But to punish me for daring to ask, for daring to make him look bad in front of his guests. He stood up, walked over to me, grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, and dragged me toward the front door. I heard Brenda's voice behind me, shaky and theatrical. "Richard, please, let's not make a scene." But we both knew she wanted this. This was what she'd been building toward for years. And when my father opened that door and shoved me out into the freezing night, locking it behind me, I finally understood. This wasn't about a Christmas gift. This was about reminding me that I would never, ever belong. I stood there on the porch, barefoot in 8 degrees below zero, and for the first few minutes I couldn't process what had just happened. My brain kept trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe someone would open the door. Maybe this was some kind of sick joke that would end any second. But the minutes ticked by, and the cold started to bite deeper, creeping up my legs and into my chest, and I realized this was real. My father had thrown me out. On Christmas Eve, in front of 30 people. And not one of them had stopped him. I pressed my hands against the window, my breath fogging the glass, and I could see them inside. Brenda with her arm around Kelsey, my father standing at the head of the table, his mouth moving, probably already spinning the story. I couldn't believe I'd ever thought of these people as family. What I didn't know yet was that my father was doing exactly what I feared. He was gaslighting the entire room, rewriting what had just happened in real time, so that by the time anyone left that party, they'd remember it his way, not mine. One of the guests, a woman named Helen who worked with Brenda, later told me what he said. He'd shaken his head sadly, poured himself another glass of wine, and explained that I was going through a phase, that I'd been unstable for years, that Brenda had been so patient trying to help me, but I just kept lashing out. He said I'd been screaming at them all day, that the question about the gift was just the final straw, that he'd had to remove me for everyone's safety. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He turned me into the villain, Brenda into the saint, and himself into the long-suffering father who'd tried his best. And because I wasn't there to defend myself, because I was outside freezing, they believed him. But here's what my father didn't count on. Ruth Calloway, our neighbor from 3 doors down, had been watching. Ruth was 72, a retired schoolteacher who didn't miss much, and she'd seen me through her window, barefoot, shivering, pounding on the door. She'd also seen the way my father had yanked the curtains shut, the way the party had continued like nothing was wrong, and she'd decided she'd seen enough. I heard her voice before I saw her, cutting through the fog in my brain. "Reese, honey, can you hear me?" I turned, and there she was, wrapped in a thick robe, carrying a blanket and a pair of slippers. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped the blanket around me and said, "I called someone. She should be here any minute." I was too cold, too shocked to ask who she meant. I just nodded, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they'd crack. Ruth stayed with me, rubbing my arms to keep the blood flowing, talking in that calm, steady voice teachers use when they're trying to keep a kid from panicking. "I've been watching you for years, Reese," she said quietly. "I've seen the way they treat you. I should have said something sooner, but I'm saying it now. This isn't right. None of this is right." Her words cracked something open in me, some wall I'd built to keep the pain from spilling out, and I started to cry. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just silent tears that froze on my cheeks. I'd been waiting for someone to see me for so long that I'd stopped believing anyone would. But Ruth had seen, and she'd done something about it. That meant more to me than she'd ever know. Then my father noticed. The front door flew open, and he stepped out onto the porch, his face red with anger. "Ruth, this is a private family matter. I need you to leave." His voice was cold, authoritative, the voice he used when he wanted to intimidate someone into backing down. But Ruth just looked at him, completely unbothered, and said, "No, just that." No explanation, no apology, just a flat refusal. My father's jaw clenched. "I'm asking you nicely. Leave my property or I'll call the police." Ruth smiled, not a kind smile, a knowing one. "You could do that, Richard. Or you could wait about 2 more minutes and see what happens. Because I think you're going to want to be real careful about who you threaten right now." I had no idea what she was talking about, but the look on my father's face, panic, barely concealed, told me he did. That's when I heard it. The low hum of an engine, the crunch of tires on snow, and then the car came into view. A sleek black limousine, completely out of place on our quiet suburban street. It pulled up to the curb, and for a second, everything stopped. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall and elegant, wearing a long wool coat and heels that clicked like a countdown. Her silver hair was pinned back, her eyes sharp and focused, and when she looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in 12 years. Recognition. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward me, her arms already opening, and she said one word that shattered everything. "Starlight." My knees buckled. Ruth caught me. And my father, for the first time in my entire life, looked genuinely afraid. This wasn't just some neighbor or concerned citizen. This was Vivian Hartwell, my grandmother, the woman I'd been told was dead. and she'd just walked back into my life with the kind of timing that only happens when someone's been waiting, watching, and planning for exactly this moment. Vivian caught me before I hit the ground, and the moment her arms wrapped around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a decade. Safety. Real, solid, undeniable safety. She smelled like lavender and something else, something warm and familiar that I couldn't place but that made me feel like a kid again. "I've got you," she whispered into my hair, and I believed her. My father was saying something, his voice loud and sharp, but I couldn't hear the words over the sound of my own heartbeat and the rushing in my ears. This wasn't possible. She was supposed to be dead. But here she was, real and alive and holding me like she'd never let go. The betrayal I'd been carrying for years exploded into something bigger, something I didn't have a name for yet. My father had lied. About everything. Richard. Vivian's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, calm but laced with steel. She didn't let go of me, but she turned her head to look at him, and the expression on her face was one I'd never seen before. Controlled fury. My father opened his mouth, started to say something about this being a misunderstanding, about how I was going through a difficult time. But Vivian held up one hand and he stopped mid-sentence. That's when I noticed the man standing beside her, tall, gray-haired, wearing a suit that screamed lawyer, even in the dim porch light. He was holding a leather briefcase, and his face was completely neutral, like he'd seen this exact situation 100 times before. Vivian glanced at him, gave a tiny nod, and he stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Douglas Pierce. I'm Mrs. Hartwell's attorney. We need to talk." My father tried to salvage the situation. He pasted on a smile, the one he used when he was trying to charm someone or get out of trouble, and said, "I think there's been some confusion. This is a private family matter, and—" Douglas cut him off. "This is not a private family matter, Mr. Mitchell. This is a legal matter. Mrs. Hartwell has been attempting to contact her granddaughter for 12 years. You have deliberately prevented that contact through a pattern of deception, manipulation, and in some cases, outright fraud. We have documentation, we have witnesses, and as of tonight, we have all the proof we need to proceed." The words hung in the cold air, heavy and undeniable. I felt Vivian's grip tighten on my shoulders, protective and fierce, and I realized something that made my chest ache. She'd been fighting for me this whole time. She'd never stopped. Brenda appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hands wringing together in that helpless gesture she used when she wanted sympathy. "Richard, what's going on? Who are these people?" But her voice cracked on the last word, and I saw it. The moment she realized they weren't going to be able to lie their way out of this one. Vivian turned to look at her, and the disgust on her face was so clear, so sharp, that Brenda actually took a step back. "You must be Brenda," Vivian said, her voice ice cold. "I've heard so much about you. Although I have to say, selling a dead woman's jewelry on Facebook Marketplace is a new low, even by your standards." Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and I saw the exact moment she understood that her secrets were no longer secret. The power she'd held over me for years evaporated in seconds. She was exposed, caught, and there was nothing she could do about it. Douglas opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick with papers. "Shall we take this inside?" he said, his tone polite but firm. My father looked like he wanted to refuse, to slam the door and pretend none of this was happening. But by now the guests had started to notice the commotion. People were peeking through the windows, whispering to each other. And my father knew. He knew that if he made a scene now, if he tried to throw out a 78-year-old woman and her lawyer, it would look even worse than it already did. So he stepped aside, jaw clenched, and gestured for them to come in. Vivian kept her arm around me as we walked through the door, and I felt every eye in that room land on us. This wasn't how I'd imagined coming back inside. But then again, I'd never imagined this moment at all. Vivian guided me to the couch, sat me down, and wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Then she turned to face the room, and when she spoke, Her voice carried authority that made everyone shut up and listen. "My name is Vivian Hartwell. I am Reese's grandmother. For the past 12 years, I have been systematically blocked from seeing or speaking to my granddaughter by Richard Mitchell. I have sent letters, gifts, cards, and money, all returned unopened. I have hired investigators, consulted with lawyers, and done everything in my power to find out if she was safe. Tonight, I was informed that she'd been locked out of this house in freezing temperatures by her own father." The room was dead silent. Every face turned toward my father, and I watched him realize that his carefully constructed narrative was falling apart in real time. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was justice, walking in through the front door with a paper trail and a witness list, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. Douglas set the briefcase on the coffee table and pulled out the first document, sliding it across to my father like a dealer laying down a winning hand. "This," he said, his voice calm and precise, "is the deed to this house. Purchased by Vivian Hartwell in 2003 for $385,000, transferred to her daughter Emma Hartwell upon her marriage to you, Mr. Mitchell. Emma's will, which we also have on file, stipulated that upon her death, the property would revert to Vivian Hartwell as trustee, with Reese Mitchell named as the sole heir upon reaching age 25, or upon completion of a 4-year degree, whichever came first." He paused, letting that sink in. "At no point was your name added to the deed. At no point did you have legal ownership of this property. You've been living here as a guest, Mr. Mitchell, a guest who has severely overstayed his welcome." The room exploded. Not with noise, no one was shouting yet, but with this rippling wave of shock that moved through the guests like a physical thing. I watched my father's face go white, then gray, and I saw Brenda's expression shift from confusion to horror as she realized what this meant. She'd been promised a house, a life, stability. She'd married my father thinking he was a man of means, a man who owned property, a man who could provide for her and Kelsey. But it was all a lie. The house she'd been living in, the room she'd taken from me, the life she'd built, it had never been hers to take. It had always belonged to my grandmother, and by extension, to me. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the truth, delivered with perfect timing by a lawyer who's been preparing for this moment for years. "That's impossible," my father said, but his voice was weak, uncertain. "I've been paying the mortgage, the property taxes, everything." Douglas nodded. "You've been paying the property taxes, yes. We have records of that. But those payments don't grant ownership. They simply fulfill a legal obligation. The mortgage was paid off by Mrs. Hartwell in 2008. You've been living in a fully owned property, rent-free, for 17 years. He pulled out another document. "We also have copies of 144 letters, cards, and packages sent by Mrs. Hartwell to Reese Mitchell between December 2013 and November 2025. Every single one was returned to sender, unopened. Many of them contain gifts, including checks totaling over $32,000 intended for Reese's education and welfare. Some have been intercepted and destroyed. Some have been," he glanced at Brenda, "sold." That's when Kelsey spoke up, her voice high and panicked. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Brenda didn't answer. She was staring at the documents like they might catch fire if she looked hard enough, and I could practically see her brain working, trying to find a way out. A lie that would work. Anything to shift the blame. But there was nowhere to shift it. Douglas pulled out a printed screenshot, one of mine, actually, though I didn't know how he'd gotten it, showing Brenda's Facebook Marketplace listing for my mother's emerald necklace. "Mrs. Mitchell," Douglas said, and the title sounded almost mocking. "This item was part of Emma Mitchell's estate. It was never yours to sell. Neither were the pearl bracelet, the diamond earrings, or the silver locket. We've contacted the buyers and arranged for the items to be returned. You will, of course, be expected to refund the money you received. If you can't, we'll consider it theft and proceed accordingly." I'd never seen Brenda speechless before. She always had something to say, some explanation, some way to twist things around so she came out looking like the victim. But right now, in front of 30 witnesses and a lawyer with a briefcase full of evidence, she had nothing. She looked at my father, desperate, like he could fix this, but he was staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists, and I realized something that might have broken me a year ago, but now just felt like confirmation. He'd known. He'd known about the jewelry. He'd known about the letters. He'd known that Vivian was alive and looking for me. He'd chosen to keep me in the dark, to keep us apart, because keeping me isolated, keeping me dependent, keeping me small, that was easier than letting me go. That was how he maintained control. And now that control was slipping through his fingers like water, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The guests started to leave. One by one, they made awkward excuses. Early mornings, long drives, babysitters, and fled into the night, probably already pulling out their phones to text their friends about the wildest Christmas party they'd ever attended. My father didn't try to stop them. He just stood there, watching his carefully curated world fall apart. And when the last guest had left, when it was just us and Vivian and Douglas, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost pleading, so different from the authoritative tone he'd used on me my whole life. "Reese, please. This isn't... I did what I thought was best for you. Your grandmother, she wanted to take you away, to pull you out of school, to uproot your entire life. I was protecting you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just this cold, clear understanding that everything he was saying was a lie. And more than that, it was a choice. He'd chosen this. Every single day for 12 years, he'd chosen to keep me from the one person who'd actually loved me. "No," I said, my voice steady, stronger than I'd ever heard it. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. You were protecting this lie, this life, this idea of a perfect family where I was the scapegoat and Brenda was the saint and you gotta play the hero. But I'm done. I'm done waiting for you to see me. I'm done standing outside in the cold, hoping you'll let me in. I'm not punishing you, Dad. I'm just stopping. I'm stopping the performance. I'm stopping the pretending. I'm stopping all of it." I stood up, still wrapped in Ruth's blanket, and I walked toward the door. Vivian followed, and so did Douglas, and I heard my father say my name one more time, but I didn't turn around. Because for the first time in my entire life, I was choosing to leave. Not being thrown out. Not being forced. Choosing. And that made all the difference. I walked out of that house, down the driveway, and into the back of Vivian's limousine without looking back once. And as we drove away, past Ruth's house where she stood on her porch waving, past the Christmas lights that still blinked cheerfully like nothing had changed, I realized something. I wasn't lost anymore. I'd been found, and the person who found me had been looking for 12 years. That kind of love doesn't quit, and neither would I. The fallout from that Christmas Eve was swift and brutal, and I won't lie. It was deeply satisfying to watch from the safety of Vivian's brownstone in Boston, 3 hours away from the town I'd grown up in. Ruth called me 2 days after Christmas to tell me that the gossip had spread like wildfire. Every single person at that party had a version of the story, and while the details varied, the core was always the same. Richard Mitchell had lied about his dead wife's mother for over a decade, locked his daughter outside in subzero temperatures, and got publicly exposed by a lawyer with receipts. The neighborhood turned on him overnight. People who'd been friendly stopped waving. Mothers who used to let their kids play at our house suddenly had other plans. Even Brenda's friends, the ones who'd defended her for years, started distancing themselves once they realized she'd been selling stolen jewelry. Karma, it turns out, doesn't always take its time. Sometimes it shows up right on schedule. Brenda left the house a week later, taking Kelsey with her. According to Ruth, she'd tried to negotiate, tried to claim that since she'd been living there as a spouse, she had some kind of legal right to stay. But Douglas had shut that down fast. She'd never been on the deed, never had a legal claim, And now that the house's true ownership was public knowledge, she had no leverage. She moved back to her mother's place 2 towns over, and the last I heard, she was working at a department store and telling anyone who'd listen that she'd been deceived by my father, that she'd had no idea about any of it. I almost laughed when Ruth told me that, because Brenda had been lying for so long that I don't think she even knew what the truth looked like anymore. But the thing about lies is that once they're exposed, they don't just affect the person who told them, they poison everything around them. And Brenda was learning that the hard way. My father tried to hold on to the house at first. He hired his own lawyer, claimed that he had adverse possession rights since he'd been living there for so long. But Vivian's legal team was ready for that too. Douglas presented a timeline showing that my father had been living there with implied permission as a guest, had never paid rent, had never made improvements to the property, and had actively prevented the legal owner, Vivian, from accessing the property or even contacting the other heir, me. The judge wasn't sympathetic. In March, Vivian received a court order granting her full legal possession, and my father was given 60 days to vacate. I didn't go back for any of it. I couldn't. Not yet. But Vivian did, and she took photos of the house, of my mother's things that my father had kept hidden in the attic, of the basement where I'd spent years of my life. And she brought all of it to me, piece by piece, reclaiming the history that had been stolen from both of us. The most painful part, though, wasn't the legal battles or the gossip, or even watching my father's life fall apart from a distance. It was reading the letters. Vivian had kept copies of everything she'd sent me over the years. 144 letters, cards, and packages, each one a little piece of love that had been returned unopened. I read them all in one sitting, spread out on Vivian's living room floor while she made tea in the kitchen and gave me space to process. The early letters were heartbroken, desperate, begging my father to let her see me just once, to let her know I was okay. The later ones were angrier, more legal, threatening action if he didn't stop interfering. But all of them, every single one, ended the same way. I love you, Starlight. I'm not giving up. And she hadn't. Even when I'd stopped believing she existed, even when I'd been told she was dead, she'd been out there, fighting. That kind of loyalty, that kind of love, I didn't know what to do with it at first. I'd spent so long believing I was unlovable that having proof of the opposite felt almost surreal. But Vivian didn't just give me letters. She gave me a future. Tucked into one of the packages from 2019 was documentation for a college fund she'd set up for me when I was born. $67,000 that had been sitting untouched because my father had never told me it existed. I always knew you'd go to college, Vivian told me, her voice thick with emotion. Your mother was so smart, so driven, and I see her in you. This is yours, Starlight. Use it for whatever you need. I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I sat on her couch and sobbed like a kid, because for the first time in my life, someone was investing in me, believing in me, giving me the tools to build a life that wasn't controlled by anyone else. I enrolled in an accelerated nursing program that fall, worked nights at a hospital as a nursing assistant, and 2 years later, I passed my boards and started as a registered nurse. I'd always wanted to help people, and now I finally had the chance. The restoration didn't happen overnight. Healing never does. But piece by piece, day by day, Vivian helped me put myself back together. She gave me the things Brenda had sold, tracked down and repurchased by Douglas's team. She gave me photos of my mother I'd never seen, stories about their life together, proof that I came from love even when it felt like I didn't. And most importantly, she gave me space. Space to be angry, to grieve, to figure out who I was now that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I started therapy. I made friends at school. I got that part-time job at the hospital and discovered I was actually pretty good at nursing. I built a life that was mine, not something handed to me or taken from me, but something I'd chosen. And every single day I woke up in a place where I was wanted. That alone felt like a miracle. The betrayal my father had inflicted didn't disappear, but it stopped defining me. And that, I think, was the real revenge. not destroying him, but refusing to let him destroy me. I reclaimed my life, my dignity, my self-worth, and I did it on my own terms. That's something he could never take away, no matter how hard he'd tried. It took me 2 years to write the letter. 2 years of therapy, of processing, of learning how to set boundaries without feeling guilty about it. But finally, on a quiet Sunday morning in my apartment near the hospital where I'd just started working as a registered nurse, I sat down and wrote it. Not to reconcile, I knew that wasn't possible, maybe not ever, but to establish what I needed going forward. The letter was short, direct, and clear. I need space to continue healing. Do not contact me. Not by phone, not by email, not through anyone else. When and if I'm ready to have a conversation, I will reach out. Until then, respect this boundary. If you truly care about my well-being, you'll honor what I'm asking. I didn't sign it, love, or your daughter. I just signed it, Reese Mitchell, because that's who I was now. Not his daughter, not Brenda's scapegoat, not anyone's punching bag. Just Reese, just me. I sent the letter through Douglas, so there'd be a legal record, and I asked him to make it clear that any violation of this boundary would be treated seriously. My father never responded. Part of me had hoped he would, not to change my mind, but maybe to apologize, to acknowledge what he'd done, to show even a flicker of remorse. But there was nothing. Radio silence. And honestly, that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't sorry. He was just sorry he got caught. The family drama, the betrayal, the years of manipulation, none of it had been an accident or a mistake. It had been a choice, made over and over again, and he'd only stopped because he'd been forced to. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, and I started focusing on the people who'd actually shown up for me. I built a life that looked nothing like the one I'd left behind. My apartment was small but bright, with big windows and plants on every surface because I'd learned I liked things that grew. I made friends at work, real friends, people who saw me for who I was and liked me anyway. I started dating, cautiously at first, learning how to trust people again, learning how to recognize red flags and walk away before I got hurt. I celebrated my first Thanksgiving at Vivian's house, just the two of us, cooking too much food and laughing at old family stories. I celebrated my first real Christmas, the kind where you're inside, where you're warm, where you're wanted. Vivian gave me a present that year, a locket with my mother's photo inside, recreated from one of the pictures she'd saved. "Memories can't be sold," she said softly. "They can't be stolen or erased. They're yours, Starlight. No one can take them away." I wore that locket every day. Still do. It reminds me where I came from, and more importantly, what I survived. Work became my anchor. Nursing wasn't just a job, it was a purpose, a way to channel everything I'd learned about pain and resilience into something that actually helped people. I was good at it too. Patients would request me by name, tell me I had a calming presence, that I made them feel safe. And every time someone said that, I thought about how unsafe I'd felt for so long, how I'd spent years walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next explosion would come. I'd turned that into something useful, something healing. That felt like justice in a way that legal documents and eviction notices never could. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And the best part? I was doing it without my father, without Brenda, without anyone who'd tried to convince me I wasn't worth anything. I'd proven them wrong just by existing, by building a life they said I'd never have. That's what real revenge looks like. Not destruction, but creation. Not tearing someone else down, but building yourself up so high they can't reach you anymore. Ruth stayed in touch. She'd call every few months, give me updates on the neighborhood, tell me that my father had finally moved out, that the house was being rented now by a young family with 2 kids. "They seem nice," she'd say. "The little girl reminds me of you." I liked hearing that. I liked knowing that the house where I'd been a ghost was now full of life, of laughter, of a family that actually functioned. It felt like closing a chapter, like the universe was saying, "That story's over. Here's a new one." And I was okay with that. I didn't need closure from my father. I didn't need him to admit what he'd done or beg for forgiveness. I just needed to know that I'd moved on, that I'd built something better, that I was finally on the other side of the betrayal. And I was. Every single day, I was. The final piece fell into place on my 25th birthday. Vivian threw me a small party, just her, Ruth, a few friends from work, and Douglas, who'd become something of a family friend over the years. We ate cake, we laughed, and at the end of the night, Vivian handed me an envelope. Inside was the deed to the house, officially transferred to my name. "It's yours now," she said simply. "You can sell it, rent it, live in it, whatever you want. But I wanted you to have it on your terms, not because someone decided for you." I stared at that piece of paper, at the address where I'd spent so many years feeling unwanted, and I realized I had a choice. I could hold on to the anger, let the house be a monument to what I'd lost, or I could let it go. So I sold it, used the money to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a small house of my own, one with a porch where I'd never be locked out, one with a kitchen where I'd never be invisible, one where I'd always be on the warm side of the glass. And that felt like the truest form of justice I could have asked for. Not revenge, not payback, just peace, just freedom, just me, finally, fully, mine. So that's my story. The whole truth, from the basement to the limo, from the lies to the reckoning. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family? Have you ever had to choose between staying in a toxic situation or walking away, even when it meant losing everything familiar? Drop a comment below and tell me, did you stay and fight, or did you leave and rebuild? Because here's what I've learned. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop waiting for people to see your worth and start showing it to yourself. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about reclaiming your dignity, your self-worth, your right to be loved without conditions. And if you're still standing on the cold side of the glass, wondering if anyone's coming to save you, this is your sign. You have to be the one who opens the door. You have to be the one who walks through it. No one else can do it for you. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own family dynamics or the boundaries you need to set, I want you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because I'll be sharing more stories like this. Stories about betrayal and justice, about breaking free and rebuilding, about what happens when you stop accepting crumbs and start demanding the whole damn table. You deserve to be on the warm side of the glass. And I'm here to remind you of that every single time you need to hear it. So comment, subscribe, and let's keep this conversation going, because your story matters. And I can't wait to hear it.